The story of Jonah is an Old Testament parable. It's not intended to describe a historical event. This short work doesn't tell us about a real person or a real city. Nineveh existed, but it describes it in a way that it had never existed. And much to many folks' disappointment, it doesn't tell a story about a real whale and a preacher that gets swallowed by one. It struggles to tell us something about God and our anger. Actually, more specifically, about our racism, about our xenophobia. And like any well-crafted parable, it's full of irony and humor and dramatic action. The story is set up this way. A Jewish man is called by God to go and preach in the capital city of Assyria. Interesting that Syria is in the news so much these days, so we've at least geographically got a point of reference. But it's set in a time when Assyria had already destroyed the northern kingdom and had pretty well messed up Judah and all of their neighbors. Assyria was practicing that ancient form of warfare that built national wealth by invading neighboring nations and stealing all their good stuff and enslaving all the talented people to build up their own economy. Assyria had never done anything good for any Jew, and they had done a lot of outlandish, criminal, reprehensibly violent, and every bad thing that they could possibly do to destroy Jewish culture, national sovereignty, and their economy. So this is a very tense setup. God tells Jonah to go and preach to the people that Jonah hates the most. Now, biblical scholars agree that this story is not nearly old enough to have been written in those days of Assyrian rule over Israel. It was written much later, probably 300 years later. It was written in a time when a tiny little remnant of Jews had come back out of captivity in Babylon to try to rebuild a nation after a century of no walled cities or meaningful economy or civilization in the area. So in those days of Reconstruction, there was a lot of hunger, there was a lot of danger, there was a lot of poverty, and there was a lot of anger. They had been bullied, they had been robbed, they'd been burned out, they'd been sold into slavery, they'd finally been dumped very vulnerable in a near barren land with no protection. The person who sat down to write Jonah evidently lived among that ragtag bunch of survivors who kept themselves alive by reminding each other of why they should hate the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Syrians and just about anyone that didn't look and sound Jewish. And when people were so certain that their hatred was justified, when they know for a fact that their enemies are bloodthirsty, venomous, subhuman individuals, then of course they turn to God, assuming that God views them in exactly the same way, that they're bad people and that they should be punished. I found myself being very provoked this year, just a few days ago on 9/11. My normal wake-up routine of turning on the news and getting a cup of coffee and sitting there and watching it, MSNBC decided that day that they were going to replay, moment by moment, the original broadcast of 9/11. I totally understand the desire to remember the day, to memorialize the dead, to honor those whose lives were lost on that horrible day and in the national actions that came as a consequence. But by asking us to watch again the wonder that what kind of plane hit the tower, and was it an accident, and has the FAA said anything? You're living through Katie Couric talking to people in New York. They're just talking about seeing people jumping out of the buildings and the image of that plume of smoke coming out, and then the image of a second plane hitting the other tower. And I don't think that what they're asking us to feel when we watch that, I don't think that's asking us to memorialize our dead. I think that's asking us to relive the confusion, the terror, the anger, the nationalism, that America is under attack, a sneak attack, a terrorist attack against unarmed civilians who were just going to work that day, who posed no threat to anyone. And watching that first hour again, and I still remember that hour. I remember exactly where I was at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning of September 11th of 2001. I remember switching between NPR and television, trying to figure out what was going on. And I believe 13 years later, I was being asked to relive that confusion and fear and anxiety. And so I wondered, do they in Iraq on Baghdad TV, do they replay moment by moment the bombing that began in Baghdad on March 18th of 2003? Do they replay that every year? And if they do, if we found out that in Iraq everyone spent March 13th watching the videos and remembering what it was like when their capital city was being bombed by American warplanes, would we think they were memorializing their dead? Or would we assume that they were showing that to remind everyone of the lethal and unjust act of war perpetrated against them by Americans so that they would continue to hate and fear Americans? I mean, I think it's obvious that we would assume that for them that would be propaganda. Isn't it propaganda when our networks do it to us? Now, whoever wrote the book of Jonah wanted to raise that issue. And he does it in a very diplomatic way. I should learn from Jonah. Jonah basically tells a bunch of jokes. He uses comedy to lower people's stress level to be able to ask them these questions about what they're getting accomplished by hating these people who have harmed them. He uses some slapstick humor to break the ice. So the story starts with Jonah going in the opposite direction of where God told him to go. And then God causes a great storm to come at sea. And even the pagan Gentiles are getting religion as they try to beg God not to drown them at sea. And finally, Jonah acknowledges that he's the problem, and they throw him overboard, and the seas calm down. Then a giant fish swallows Jonah and takes him where he was supposed to be. I mean, you may have been told this story as literal history, but if you had never heard it before, you would realize this is really kind of funny. It's a ridiculous story. Because everyone in the story is being obedient to God. The weather is obedient to God. The sea is obedient to God. Even pagan sailors, and if you've ever been around a seaport much, pagan sailors and religion don't usually go together that much. So everything in this story is about everyone being obedient to God except the preacher. Don't go too far with that. But Jonah's got a serious mad on. It's not just that he thought Judaism was better than the religion of Assyria. It's not that he thought that Israel or Judah was just that much better a nation than Babylon or Egypt or Syria. It was that he had seen the wreckage firsthand. He had seen the people jumping out of the tower. He had seen the burning buildings. He had heard the clank of chains of slavery in the streets of Jerusalem. He knew people who had been killed. He had seen the evil being done. He knew about the rape and the robbery and the bloodshed. So his anger was a righteous anger that doesn't really believe that anyone who disagrees with him can be anything but stupid or evil or probably some of both. And we all know people that are this way, that you will get that forwarded email or get that post on Facebook that just seems to presume that if you don't hate Arab Muslims, that there's something wrong with you, that you don't love your country or you're not a good person. We've recently had this whole debate about Syria going on in the news, and you remember last year, John McCain was on the TV talk show saying, I've been to Syria, I've met with the rebels, they are desperate for our aid. We absolutely must arm them against Assad. Well, the them, of course, was ISIS. So a year ago, we have a United States senator meeting with this terrorist army, insisting that we arm them against President Assad. A year later, John McCain is back on the TV talk shows demanding that we arm President Assad's army against ISIS, and he just can't understand why it's not being done. What I can't understand is why they're still interviewing John McCain. He actually claimed to have gone over and vetted the moderates. He vetted Sarah Palin. At what point do we stop accepting that this guy is going to vet somebody? There is an element of our government, of our population, that just really doesn't want to look at history. That what happened when we armed the Mujahideen, where did those arms end up? We have been training the Iranian army for 10 years. And then when faced by ISIS, they take off their uniforms, they've got their street clothes on underneath, drop their arms, leave the protected banks and resources, and all of this just gets taken into the hands of ISIS. So our public is frightened, we're xenophobic, we want to feel safe, and we want revenge. Some of the stuff that's been posted on YouTube, some of the assassinations and attacks are too gruesome. It's too much. So we want revenge. That, men and women, is exactly where Jonah was. Jonah walks into the middle of this huge, monstrous city and delivers a sermon. It's described in one sentence. I hope that not many of mine could be summed up quite so simply, but the writer of Jonah describes his sermon in one sentence. 40 days hence, God is going to rain some stuff on you guys, and you're going to be a piece of history. Then the narrative says, against all odds, the entire city repents. From the king to the cattle in the field. One text says the cattle were wearing sackcloth and ashes. Now, if you've ever milked cows, if you've ever run into a repentant cow, I'd like to hear about it. But this very brief sermon that Jonah delivers is so effective that everybody repents. But of course, that's full of irony. Jonah didn't want them to repent. He just kind of liked telling them they were going to be destroyed. He thought God should destroy them. Isn't that God's business? Isn't God on the side of the good guys and against the bad guys? Doesn't God destroy evil people? Didn't God see the 9/11 videos? Didn't God see the videos of people being beheaded? Doesn't God want to wipe out ISIS just as much as we do? By the way, our drones that we use in the Middle East also all have video capability. So we are in possession, the American government is in possession of video of our drones killing thousands of innocent civilians. Those videos, however, are never released to the public. And the few people that have tried to release that sort of thing to the public are either in prison or they're hiding in Russia now. But the videos exist. It's not just ISIS that has executed innocent people. In fact, they're way behind the head count, to use the bloody euphemism. Jonah goes up on a ridge then after this repentance to watch and see if the city won't mess up. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, ladies and gentlemen. You don't have to have a degree in psychology to know that that one is true. Most people will do again what they've always done. So he's going to sit and watch. And he doesn't expect to watch very long. And in the watching, the only company that Jonah has is his anger. And you may think that's a strange way to describe it, but your emotions can become like a partner to you. Søren Kierkegaard once wrote, "My depression has been my most faithful mistress. Is it any wonder that I return her affection?" I mean, he quite literally understood his depression to be another person who was a companion to him in his life. And depression, psychologically speaking, is just anger without enthusiasm. I mean, really, you know. So Jonah is sitting up there with his anger, and he's watching. Alcoholics Anonymous teaches that anger is the dubious luxury of ordinary people. It's a luxury because it's an emotion that people who don't have a drinking problem might be able to revel in. They might enjoy it. Their anger might keep them company. Just as we have seen anger become a form of entertainment. What is Fox News and talk radio but anger entertainment? It stimulates people, gets their pulse quickened, it gets their respiration up because they're mad about something. It's anger entertainment. But Alcoholics Anonymous say it's a luxury that belongs to people who don't drink, because they recognize that if an alcoholic lets themselves become angry, that they're going to be drunk pretty soon. It's still a dubious luxury because even the people that aren't going to get drunk don't appear to get much out of it. Have you ever met anyone that got a lot smarter on the basis of watching partisan news? It doesn't make people smart. It certainly doesn't make them spiritual. It doesn't make them compassionate. It doesn't make them loving. And a whole lot of the time, it makes them do something that's very self-destructive. An alcoholic will drink, but a lot of other people will do other very self-destructive things. How many of your friends or your family members can you no longer talk to because they've baptized themselves in the anger rhetoric, and you can no longer even communicate meaningfully with them? The big book of AA calls anger a poison, and I'm increasingly convinced that that is true. But let me return to the biblical story. Jonah's sitting on the ridge watching the city, and this vine grows up quickly, covers the little shelter that he's made so that it's suddenly several degrees cooler. Those of you that have had to work in the hot sun know that you can lower the temperature of your body by 10 or 15 degrees by just having some shade. So Jonah's got two companions now. He's got this vine and he's got his anger. And then, just like the weather, the sea, the fish, the pagan sailors, everyone's obedient to God. God sends a worm. God tried to send a preacher. That didn't work out so well. God sends a worm. The worm does God's will, chews through the base of the vine dies, and that's the last straw for Jonah. Everything's gone wrong. Now his potato vine is dead, and so he rants at God, "It's better if I die than if I live." And God says to Jonah, "So you're mad about the bush?" And Jonah says, "Yes, I am. I'm angry enough to die." And the Lord said, "You're concerned about the vine. You didn't plant it. You didn't labor for it. You didn't grow it. It came into being in a night, perished in a night. And yet you are convinced that I should not be concerned about Nineveh, a great city where there are more than 120,000 people who do not even know their left hand from their right." When God asked Jonah, "Do you do well to be angry?" it is apparent that Jonah doesn't even understand the question, because anger itself becomes its own logic. It is convincing by itself. If you try to fact check a lot of the angry broadcast on talk radio or on the faux news programs, people are not impacted by the fact that there's no facts there, that they will go along with the anger because the anger itself is self-evident, literally. The anger, the emotion, the feeling is all the evidence you need. And why wouldn't he be angry? Assyrians had been violent. Be angry at God because God doesn't appear to care. Angry at the vine for dying. Angry enough, he says, to die. And we've all seen that played out. You can get angry at illegal immigrants just because there are Spanish signs up at the hardware store. You've seen the letters to the editor. People are absolutely incensed that Spanish is being put on signage right here in the Ozarks. We can be angry at Muslims because if what you know about Islam is what you've gotten off of television news, evidently every Muslim is walking around with a suicide bomber vest on. You can be angry at those greedy teachers and firemen and policemen and auto workers for demanding salaries that put city governments and businesses into bankruptcy. You can be angry at bankers who help to wreck the economy. You can be angry at gay people for thinking that they ought to have the same civil rights as straight people. How did our famous local defense attorney put it? Dee Wampler said that he was sick and tired of gay people shoving things down his throat. You just have to wonder, can this guy hear himself? I mean, does he have any awareness of what he's saying? It is not that Jonah and his people didn't have reason to be angry. It's not that ISIS is not a terrorist army capable of subhuman acts of violence. It is that our anger doesn't solve the problem. It never has. It always makes it worse. The message of Jonah to the people who first read it was that their captivity in Babylon was over, and it was time for them to stop hating the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Egypt. They needed to stop hating their own countrymen who had married people of another race because they lived in a foreign nation. It was time for them to stop discriminating against mixed blood Jews or Jews who spoke another language or even Jews who practiced the religion of Assyria rather than the religion of Israel. We face those issues. My father died at the age of 91, would never own or ride in a Japanese car because for him, Pearl Harbor was never over. And I didn't have the heart to tell him that the majority of his Buick came from Japan, but sometimes information just upsets people. But if you take that perspective, it's never over. The world isn't what it was, and it never will be that again. Our immigration laws have changed. There are now more Muslims in the United States than there are Episcopalians or Presbyterians. If you know Presbyterians and Episcopalians and you don't know any Muslims, that is because of the self-segregation of our society. There are more Muslims here than there are Presbyterians. The economy of the Americas is now blended, and there will always be English and speaking people in every state of the United States. That is how it is going to be from now on. Men and women, there are times when it is right to be angry, and we say, "Thou shalt not stand idly by." I'm not advocating indifference to social injustice. We can't stand idly by. But as Aristotle noted in his book of Ethics, he said, anyone can be angry. That's easy. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, that's hard. That's difficult. Anger is an immediate emotion available to us that we have mistaken as a masculine emotion. But I can tell you, psychologically, it's always rooted in fear. Anger is the fight or flight response. Anger is fear. If you want to deal with your anger, you have to stop being afraid. Our nation is trying to figure out how to untangle ourselves from a war that's already lasted 4 or 5 years longer than World War II, and yet we are still angry. And our news media is still asking us to be afraid of terrorists. The book of Jonah asks us, do you do well to be angry? Do you? How has it helped us? In generations past, we've invaded Mexico. In fact, a lot of Mexico is now the United States. You have congressmen going out to New Mexico and Arizona and say, "Look how there's so many Mexicans here." Well, it was Mexico. So it happens. We invaded Canada at one point. We've gone to war with England and France and Germany and Japan, all of which are now close allies and trading partners, with the exception maybe of France, but we still have our moments. It's possible for old enemies to become allies. It's possible to find a way around the anger to something that is much more healthy, not only out of fear, but out of courage, not in ignorant naivete, but in powerful faith. Anger is rooted in fear. So my modest suggestion is that our anger has led us into an eye for an eye mentality that has made our nation nearly morally blind. I think it's time for those of us who live in the land of the free and the home of the brave to stop being such cowards. We will not fight our way into peace.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.